You want to check me out? Okay. I'm Dan Crinsley, and I certainly didn't have the experiences that John had. He made a career of it, and I was not in that long. On December 7th, I was having a Sunday dinner with my father, mother, and my little sister in a very well-known restaurant at Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, which was one of our favorites, and we were busy nibbling away at our lunch, which was always a seafood lunch. And it overlooked Sheepshead Bay. It had a wonderful view of the bay. And they had radios scattered around various parts of the huge dining room, which could accommodate at least 100 people. And the radio usually played dinner music of some sort. And then there was an announcement that they had a very important message from one of the Washington sources of the military, and they made the announcement that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And everybody started chatting amongst themselves, and it was quite a bit of news, naturally. And we finished our lunch, and then we returned home. My father had been a veteran of World War I. He was also a Navy man. Unfortunately, he didn't have an opportunity to serve overseas. He was mostly landlubber. And he said to me, he said, Dan, he said, you gotta serve, you gotta send yourself into the Navy. He said, as long as you know how to swim, he said, you'll have a bed every night to sleep in. And so I followed up on that. And maybe a couple of months later, I went down to Pine Street in downtown New York, where the Navy had the office, and I signed up for one of their programs. When the war broke out, obviously we had lost an awful lot of major large ships, and we understood we'd been fighting a Pacific War and an Atlantic War, and it would be necessary to train thousands and thousands of men to operate the machines of war. And also, beyond that, it required a certain amount of intelligence and experience and training to operate the newer inventions of war. And so all of the parts of the military established programs, training programs. And I had investigated the Navy training program, which was referred to as V7. And the V7 program was interested in enlisting the services of recent graduates of the universities and colleges, and also the college students who were near their graduation, to enlist them in the programs, which would be programs which would be associated with the Navy training, but it would be tremendously abbreviated, obviously, because of the needs to get them trained as fast as possible. This was over and above Annapolis and the training stations of the Army and the Air Force. So I went down to Pine Street where the Navy office was, and they examined me, and the only thing I had was hay fever to report. And they said, you'll be at sea, you don't have to worry about hay fever. So I signed up, and well, that was probably sometime in December of perhaps 41. And I was at Brooklyn College at the time, and I had immediately accelerated my program. Instead of taking the summers off, I was going to go through the summer working. And anyway, they called me up in 1942. I guess I was about 19 at the time. And I needed, perhaps 6 or 7 extra points because of my acceleration in order to have enough degrees to graduate and get my degree. And I got orders in the mail. They were calling me up, and I was to report to the University of Rochester. And the date I was to leave was a couple of weeks later. It was short notice. And on that particular day, which I believe was a Sunday, my father accompanied me, was going to accompany me. Excuse me. One thing I certainly remember, my mother was at the door. We had a brownstone in Brooklyn. My mother was at the door, and she was bawling. She was crying, hugging me as if she'd never seen me again. And my father and I got on the subway, went down to Grand Central Station, and he saw me off. We got on a train with several hundred other young men, and we went up to the University of Rochester. And I spent about 4 months there, and the reason for that was that all of the schools with a V7 program had filled up. There was no room at a particular time for a class which I was to enter. But after 4 months there, and I got enough credits to extend them back to Brooklyn College, and I would become part of the graduating class of the following year. And then I was sent to a few other schools for additional training. And then toward the end of that particular year, that was 42, I entered Columbia University. And it was a very, very short program. And it was arranged so that they would look you over as you were training. You did not walk from one class to the other. I happened to be in a dormitory facing Broadway. I was on the 4th floor. There were no elevators in those buildings, and you didn't walk up the stairs, or you were told to run up the stairs. And then when you would assemble for either breakfast, lunch, or dinner, which was, perhaps about 15 or 20 minutes away from the dormitories, you didn't march, you ran. And then when you got into the dining room, there was a long cafeteria line. And you learned after a couple of days that if you didn't start eating when you got on that line, 20 minutes later, it was time for the next formation to which you would run. So you started eating immediately while you were on that line if you were smart enough to get any food. Anyway, it was that was the program, and it was very intensive. The classes were for engineering. You learned gunnery. They had guns. You learned how to recognize a Japanese plane in a part of a second, because you wanted to make sure you were shooting down the right plane, and so on and so forth. And we had a certain amount of sea training, and about 4 or 5 months later, I was graduating. They lost about, I would say, 25% of their entering class because the standards were very, very high. The expression was, it looks like Johnny washed out yesterday. Washed out means he would be separated, and he would be just sent to one of the training stations, and he would be a sailor. His opportunity to get a commission as an officer was gone for that particular time. Anyway, I graduated, and I was commissioned an ensign, and I received my initial orders to report to a training station at Newport, Rhode Island. And our ship was under construction at the South Boston Navy Yard. And it was several months away from completion. And so while I was waiting for the completion, there was additional training at Newport. And the day I reported, I got my instructions to report to a commander who was in charge of the base. And at the special time, it was about maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, I arrived at the commander's office, walked in, gave him a snappy salute, and said, "Ensign Crinsley reporting for duty, sir." And the commander sort of looked up, looked me over, and he looked at his watch, and he said, "Ensign Crinsley, do you know anything about radio direction finders?" And I replied, "Well, sir, I had a course for a couple of days at that at Columbia." He said, "Very well, good." He said, "You're on in 10 minutes at room 42. So I went to room 42, and there were about 20 men in the class, and they looked me over, and I looked them over, and there were some old chiefs sitting there looking at me, and a couple of the sailors who were not too much older than I was, about 20 men in the class. And I had to wing it, which I did. Fortunately, I was lucky enough to get by in about 40 minutes. And they sort of nodded as if, thank you. And that was part of my training for the next couple of months. The advantage of Newport, as you might suspect, it was one of the places for the social season every year. It had beautiful mansions along the bay. There have been movies about that place. Wealthy people had built beautiful homes, and the young women from these buildings entertained the young officers from the Newport training station every weekend. We had wonderful dinners and dances and so on, so I can't complain about that assignment. Anyway, a couple of months later, my ship was completed. It was the U.S. Topeka CL-67. It was a light cruiser, brand new, and it had, is there a picture of it? Yeah, okay. The main thing to tell you about the Topeka, first of all, it had a complement of about 2,000 men. So it was a rather large ship. To the right, of course, was the front of the ship, and it had 2 8-inch gun turrets. That was the diameter of each one of the shells. And on the rear, there was one turret, triple, and then on either side of the stern, on the left to the right, were catapults. And each one of these catapults contained an SC-3 Seahawk. It was a single range seat plating with floats on below other side of the wing for stability. There was no front of the cockpit. There was just the pilot, and if it didn't have too much radio equipment, it probably could accommodate one other observer. And since the catapults were fore and aft, it should be obvious to you that you could not fire the plane directly in front of you. The plane had to be fired if you were on the starboard side, the right side of the ship. It had to be moved a little to the left. Consequently, on the left side, it had to be moved to the left. Now, when you were firing a plane, I should add, of course, I don't know how it happened, but they sized me up as to be the catapult officer for the ship. I did not ask for that assignment because it had an awful lot of responsibility attached to it forthwith. In order to fire the plane from the starboard side, the plane was moved a little, the catapult was moved a little bit to the right, obviously, to clear all the body of the ship. Don't forget the ship is pitching up and down, and it is moving left and right. And so it's quite a challenge when you fire that catapult, when you fire the plane off the catapult. First of all, the pilot has to give you a signal that he's got his second training with the plane. He's got it firing at first, making sure that everything is working properly. He's adjusting the engines, of course. And there is a gunner's mate because the catapult is fired with a gas shell. The shell is ignited to one side of the catapult, and there is a gunner's mate who is going to fire that plane off the catapult. And so the procedure goes like this. The first thing you do is you look at the gunner's mate to make sure the shell is in position and ready. And then, before you do anything else, you look at the pilot. He gives you a thumbs up, meaning the engine is ready to go. The next thing you do is you look at the ship. You look at the ship that's pitching up and down or moving right or left. When you are satisfied that you are reaching the top of the pitch and the direction has stopped is when you give the gunner's mate the command to fire. And that plane goes off at about 60 miles an hour. And you hold your breath, and so does the pilot, to make damn sure that you have cleared the ship. Thank God I've never lost a pilot in any of those takeoffs. And so that was the experience on the ship. Of course, we had several. I should also add a few other little details to you before we got there. After the ship was completed at the South Boston Navy Yard, we had what is called a shakedown cruise. This is the opportunity for all the crew to make sure that the equipment aboard the ship is operating properly, the guns are functioning properly, and the engineers below deck making sure that the engines are are operated correctly. And we took a trip down into the Caribbean for about 2 weeks or so before we went out to the Pacific, make sure everything was operating, and then we went to the canal. That was an interesting experience too. I got the worst sunburn I've ever had because I had to be out all deck making sure that the ship's sides were clearing the sides of the canal. Anyway, we went to Hawaii. Hawaii is where we loaded up all the ammunition to be fired from the ship. And the guns, of course, we had the 6-inch guns. I should tell you that the diameter of the shell of a light cruiser is 6 inches, and a heavy cruiser is 8 inches in diameter. And they have a range of 15, maybe 20 miles. And the reason for the planes aboard ship are for observational purposes, because the people who fire the guns do not know where those shells, because the curvature of the earth, the distance and so on, they don't know where those shells are landing with respect to the ships. So obviously they have to be a lot closer, and we put up these planes, weather permitting, for observational purposes to see where those shells are landed. And we loaded the ammunition at Hawaii, and then we sailed out into the Pacific, and joined the larger fleets that were moving up the coasts and up the islands. We would take one island and we would move up to the next. And our particular job was shelling the shore installations, softening them up prior to the landing of the men, who would then move on shore and hopefully take the island. Some of my, we finally wound up, I should say, at Okinawa. So it was toward the end of the war. And we were involved, not to the extent that John was. I think he may have mentioned that the formation was that the carriers, the most important ship in the whole fleet, was protected. The carrier was in the middle of a circle. The next thing were the heavier equipment, both the battleships and the heavy and the light cruisers. They formed the next shell. And then, of course, the ones really taking the beat were the ones that John was on, the destroyers. They were the ones that were on the outer shell, and they were the ones that were getting the shot from the kamikazes. It was toward the end of the war. Kamikazes were coming in fewer and fewer as they were being shot down. I have seen the kamikazes, fortunately, at a distance. No kamikazes got near us. You have to remember that as the kamikazes were coming in, there was a ring of fire that was being shot at the kamikazes. Thousands of pounds, thousands of 40 millimeter, 6-inch, 20 millimeter, everything you could think of was being fired as the kamikazes came in. So they never got close to our ship, even though it was in the middle, it wasn't in the inside. So I've seen them come in, but they never got close to our ship. The war ended, of course. When the war ended, there's another experience that I'll never forget. At that particular time, we were off the coast of Japan, and we had shelled some of the southern coast at a distance, and I would venture to say we were probably maybe 30 or 40 miles off the coast, and I was on the rear deck with the gunnery officer of the ship, who was a commander, and I was showing him some of our equipment around the planes. The ships. I should say that the Seahawk, the plane, if it wasn't on the catapult, we had a large platform in the middle between the catapults that went down, and we could put these planes, if the weather was really bad, we could lower these planes, we could detach the wings, move them down below deck to keep them out of the weather. And so I was showing him some of that equipment, and then a message came over the radio speaker, and it said, now hear this, now hear this. We have a message from the captain. And the captain of the ship was a man by the name of Schindler, Captain Schindler. Wonderful guy. I have to tell you about that a little later. And he said, I have to report the following news, which I have just received from Naval Headquarters. This was after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, about a week. The war is over. The Japanese had surrendered unconditionally. And the commander, who was standing next to me, said, God damn it. And I looked at him in shock, because you could hear the rest of the men shouting all around. They were so happy. And then I thought about this a while, and then it occurred to me that he had been an Annapolis graduate. And as a result of that, when the Navy had to really move up its officers as quickly as possible, he had gone from a recent graduate of Annapolis as an ensign, first as a Lieutenant JG, and then as a lieutenant. So when the war started, he was a lieutenant. And then, of course, during the war, he had rapidly moved up from lieutenant to lieutenant commander, and then he was now a commander. And that's the reason he was cursing the end of the war. Anyway, at that particular time, the you don't remember, you were too young to remember, but there was a point system. Obviously, we had hundreds of ships that had been built by that time, and they couldn't just say go home. The ships had to be manned and had to be controlled, and so there was a point system. And the point system depended upon your age, responsibilities, whether you were an only son, whether you contributed to the upkeep of the family, how necessary you were at home. If you were a single guy, if you were married, had children, and it was important for you to get back, then you needed less credits to get out. I was single, I was not necessary at home, nobody depended on my income, and so I had to wait a long time, many months, almost a year, which was not tough because I was able to tour around free of charge, and I finally was separated from a place in off the coast of China, as a matter of fact. And I then got on a transport. I was separated from our ship. I should say that I was called in by the captain at that time. The Navy tried very hard to keep as many reserve officers aboard as possible, and I had served my time, and the captain, who got to know me, gave me a very warm talk about how he would really enjoy me, re-upping for at least another year or so. But I said, no, I said, I have my heart set on becoming a geologist and so on. And although I've enjoyed the experience, I really would like to get back to school. He said, I understand. And so we were transferred to transports. We crossed, we picked up people at Buckner Bay. We picked up some men who had been out for 3 years, who hadn't had a chance to get back. And we crossed the ocean. We had all kinds of storms. It was a terrible experience. And we were headed for San Francisco. The final destination was a little place called, I think they called it, it was called Treasure Island. It was one of the small islands, and that was a separation place. And one of the things I will not forget is coming out of all that stormy weather, and as we got close to San Francisco, the sun came out, the weather cleared, and as we entered the harbor, the sun was reflecting off the glass of all of the apartments, buildings, the skyscrapers of San Francisco, and the men, these are hundreds of men, came out on deck, and these were old, grizzled veterans, and they were crying. I'll never forget that. Anyway, I got back, and I stayed in the reserve for a while. I took advantage of the opportunity to go back to school, which I did, and I continued my education and went through school, got my various degrees, and joined the Geological Survey, and several years after that, it was like 1964, I had an assignment in Heidelberg, Germany, and I was walking down the street one day, and an officer came in my direction, and I could see from his gold braid that he looked like he was an admiral. And as we drew closer, I recognized him, and he recognized me. It was Captain Schindler from the Topeka. And he said to me, "Dan Krensley." I was flabbergasted that he remembered my name. He said, "What are you doing here?" I explained very quickly. He said, "I'm retiring this week, and you're coming to my retirement party, which is just next door." There was Captain Schindler. He was now an admiral. That was just fantastic to meet after at least 10, 15 years. Anyway, that was my experience.
You're up, man. Stan, you're up. Your turn.
My name is Stanley Turkel. That's Turkel. I am a New Yorker, born and bred in the wonderful city of New York, and raised my family and my 4 children there. And if you didn't realize it, it's the best city in the world. And I'm happy in Alexandria, and certainly happy in this wonderful Hermitage place with all these great staff and programs and facility. Just a great place to be. My experience in the service, the United States service, was vastly different than the 2 you just heard. I was an early graduate of a high school in New York at age 15 years of age. So I started college when I was 16 years old. I turned 16 in September 1941, and I started at New York University. I was young, of course, inexperienced, and how shall I say, way over my head. But who could have predicted that a war would break out, and that I would be on the campus of NYU, and the war was starting, and so as a young 16-year-old, what did I know? Not much, inexperienced, and I thought, how exciting. So what did I do? Much to my mother's chagrin and unhappiness, I enlisted in the United States Army Air Force. Don't forget, there was a Navy Air Force and an Army Air Force in those days, no Air Force on its own. So I enlisted in the Army Air Force at age 16, and I was on the campus as a freshman. All my classmates were 2 years older than I was, so I felt as though I was some sort of child among men, but nothing to be done about that. But I was in the Reserve Officers Training Corps. And in those days, that was called the ROTC, an initialing that was widely used apparently. So I had then training. We had fake guns. I'm talking about rifles that were made of wood. We had uniforms, which we wore, and we marched in drill formation with those fake wooden guns. Also, I did shooting they had a rifle range, and I had certain times when I went down to the range and shot and tried to improve my marksmanship. I was enlisted in the United States Army Air Force, as I said, as an aviation cadet. What that was that if you were in good physical shape, lucky with good eyesight, and good coordination, you could be selected to become either a pilot or a navigator. Those were the two. And the third was a bombardier, but apparently that was not as highly, did not require as high a physical attribute as the other two. In any event, I was set to become, if I ever got called in, and ultimately I did get called. When I was 17 and a half years old, I was called to start my service, and I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Fort Dix was an entry place. It was a permanent base in New Jersey, and I think I was there for 2 weeks is all, to get a uniform, to get examined physically, and to be signed up. And then I was sent to my first Air Force base. Are you ready for this? Blytheville, Arkansas. Blytheville, Arkansas? Did you ever hear of such a place? It was apparently an Air Force base that was built fairly recently. So it was, how shall I say, it had barracks, it had a mess hall, and very little else. It was poorly facilitated. But nevertheless, we engaged in basic training, and that was, I was in good physical shape. I considered myself to be an athlete and played all the sports, and so I was able to take it in stride and come out on top. In any event, we did that. I can't remember how many months I was there, but we finished our basic training and then was shipped off to Columbus, Ohio, to the Lockburn Air Force Base. Now then, that was a permanent base which flew B-17s and trained pilots and crew for the Flying Fortress, which was the very airplane that flew over Germany from London and from England to bomb Germany early in the war. Very successful bombing runs of these flying fortresses. You cannot imagine how big a flying fortress is. Well, maybe you can now, because there are passenger ships that you have flown on before this pandemic that were that large. But in those years, I'm talking about the 1940s, that plane was a fortress. It was. That was properly good naming for it, a flying fortress. In any event, so I trained on flying fortresses. My training was slowed up because apparently the losses over Germany were less than they expected, so they didn't need to train these up-and-coming aviation cadets. So I then did a variety of other jobs on the Air Force bases. At Lockburn, I was a phys ed instructor. I used to take the crews out on long runs, on exercise routines, and I was, can you imagine, Stanley Turkel, nice Jewish boy from the Bronx in New York, wearing suntan pants with an orange stripe down the side and a t-shirt that said Lockburn Air Force Base, and I would train these other cadets, go out on long runs, long distance runs, exercise routines, because I was apparently, by their measurement, in better shape than they were. And then I also had a job once as a parachute inspector. What does that mean? It means that the pilots who were in training, you wore a small packaged parachute on their chest, and it hooked on to a strap formation around their waist, and this was, yes, it had an oxygen mask, and thank you. And in any event, this parachute I had to examine the parachute from the outside to make sure that it was not unraveling, that it was still in good folded condition, so that if unfortunately one of these guys who were way up needed to use it, that it would open when they jumped. And so that was the job I had. I also had a job as a flight engineer. That was the best of all. I flew on the Flying Fortresses. I trained to be a flight engineer. I was not an officer. I was an enlisted man, but they had a crew, and I was one of the crew. Usually a minor member of the crew, relatively inexperienced, but nevertheless necessary. So I had that experience. I then was shipped out after a while and went down to Turner Field in Albany, Georgia. Well, that was a field that was built just for World War II. So like Blytheville, Arkansas, it was relatively unfinished, relatively unfurnished, I should say, with not a lot of facilities. But you know, when you're 18 years old, you don't know what you don't know. You are inexperienced, and the excitement of being in the service and being away from home was extraordinary. In a measure, it was like being away at college when you're a teenager. And with my friends, we did dumb things, we behaved badly, we did stupid things, we got caught sometimes, but we had, how shall I say, when you're 18 years old, I called it a lot of fun. Stupid, inexperienced, childish fun. In any event, so those, and maybe one or two other bases I'm not mentioning, I spent 2.5 years in the service and had a variety of different experiences, never went overseas. Then when the war ended, as Dan described and John described, I was with others then, because the war was not continuing against Japan. I was discharged and came home. And coming home, I will inform you, Dan was very modest about saying this. There's something called the GI Bill of Rights that was passed by the United States government. Don't forget, there were more than 2 million men, mostly, who served in various parts of the United States service during World War II, in the 4 years it took for us to beat Japan and Germany. So those 2 million men, the United States government was concerned about how to treat the returning veterans who were coming back from this service that they had, where they saved the United States government from being defeated by Japan and Germany. And what they remembered, you may not know this, or you may know it historically, you may know that after World War I, the veterans who came back from service were treated badly. The veterans from World War I were treated so badly, they were promised a bonus. And the bonus was never paid. And the veterans formed marches on Washington called the bonus marchers, who would come and protest. They hid out in, how many of you know where is Anacostia Flats, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., Anacostia Flats. And apparently that's where they set up a tent city, these bonus marchers who came back to try to get the Congress to give them the money that was promised to them, which they never ever got. What happened was that the United States under, I think, what president was it? I don't remember anymore. I think it was, maybe it was Hoover. He called upon Douglas MacArthur, the famous Douglas MacArthur general who won the war in World War II in the Far East, but he was then a young general, just beginning his career, well, beginning at the level of that career, and he headed up the army to disturb and break down these bonus marches and ship these protesting veterans back home without their bonus. So that was a great beginning to Douglas MacArthur's career. Anyway, I share that history with you because behind this kindly old face of mine is a historian. You may know that I spent my life my working life as a hotel man and have managed hotels, managed large companies that ran and owned hotels, was a hotel consultant, and now I am the most widely published, believe it or not, even at this advanced age, the most widely published hotel consultant in the United States, with a record of 250 published articles and 10 books. So I became a hotel man and a hotel expert, but I managed hotels in my early years, was a general manager of hotels. So I will leave you and finish my tale of experience by telling you that when I give praise to how this place is managed, I'm talking about our own Hermitage, and say that Chris Gardner and his staff and his crew and all the people who work here run this place like a professional hotel. And I give them all the credit in the world, because it is a tough job, never to be taken for granted. And what they did and what they're doing and getting through this pandemic and the difficult circumstances that we find our country in, that they run this place as well as it's run, is a miracle. Thank you. Oh, one more thing. If you want to see what an 18-year-old dopey kid looks like in uniform, I'll pass this around and you can see Stanley Turkel when he was just enlisted in the Air Force.
It's Marvin's turn. Where's Marvin?
Start back in December 1741. I and a friend were in the basement of our home. I had built a ping pong table, and we were breaking it in. And while we were listening to the music, we had a break that Pearl Harbor was bombed. We couldn't believe it, of course, but that's what happened. I was about 17 then. And I immediately joined the civilian police. And of course I had to check the neighborhood and get the lights off and whatever, close your windows. And I turned 18, I was in high school, just waiting for graduation. And I got picked out, pulled out, and placed in the 141st Medium Maintenance Combat Ordnance, which means we're on the line, behind the lines, retrieve, return, repair, whatever the occasion was, whether it was a truck, a tank, anything, even glasses. And that was our job. I was there 5 months. And then, of course, the bulge. We were told to get out quickly. And we were about a block away when the building we were using blew up. An 88 apparently hit it. And that's it. No excitement. We lost about 5, 6 fellows. I guess I'm lucky I came back with a little less hearing and a couple of scars. And that's it. I really grew up in the Army, learned respect, and to do the job. I came back after the bulge. We were supposed to get ready to go east to the Orient, and that's when the war ended. I was with my parents at that time at one of the parks, and I got a telegram from our CO to come back, and we're getting out. The war had ended, and That was wonderful, except my parents were very ill. And that was it. That's my life story, really. And have no regrets. But I've had enough of it. Next time I go in, I'm gonna be a chef. So there you are, all done, all finished. And here I am. All right, that's it. Make it nice and quick and easy.